welcome back to the Colonel Frank Seeley Baccalaureate Virtual Lectures. Today's lecture has a history theme. I'm going to talk to you about the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. The SOE was a clandestine British organisation which was established on the 22nd of July 1940. It specialised in espionage, sabotage and reconnaissance missions during World War II. At this time, many countries were occupied by Nazi German troops or the other Axis powers. And one of the SOE's objectives was to support the local resistance organisations which were secretly fighting back against these occupying forces. The SOE was a top secret organisation. Very few people were aware of its existence, and other organisations such as the Admiralty and the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry were used as cover. The SOE has been nicknamed Churchill's Secret Army after the Prime Minister who was in charge when it was set up, or also the Baker Street Irregulars, which is a nod to Sherlock Holmes, but also due to the fact that the headquarters were on Baker Street in London. You can see the plaque that is there in the picture. The main aims of the SOE were to stir up resistance, as I've said, which would make the occupying Axis powers, it would force them to spend their manpower and resources trying to control those populations. Much later, the SOE was also involved in the creation of clandestine armies who would rise up to assist the Allies in the liberation of their homeland. So, my particular interest in the SOE relates specifically to Section F, who were working in France with the resistance movements working against the occupying forces in France, but the SOE agents did work in anywhere that was occupied by Axis powers. So this included parts of Western and Eastern Europe, but also Southeast Asia, where Japan was the occupying force. And if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about that, the name of the SOE branch in Southeast Asia was Force 136 or Force 136. The thing that I find particularly interesting about SOE agents is that because they were working undercover, they couldn't just enter the country that they were working in. So they often had to be dropped by parachute at night, or they would be transported by submarine or small boat in secret. The thing that I find particularly inspiring about the SOE agents was the fact that they came from all walks of life. It was a great leveller being in the SOE. So they recruited people of all classes and occupations, but also in all sections of society, even those sections of society that would have been vilified at the time. So, for example, at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, the SOE recruited known homosexuals. At a time when communists were viewed with suspicion and considered to be politically dangerous, the SOE recruited communists, and the SOE also recruited members of the criminal underworld. As long as you were bright and had potential and the skills they needed, they would consider recruiting you. They also had a much more contemporary attitude towards women. So there were many female agents who were sent into the field to work as wireless operators or couriers, and they weren't recruited to go into combat roles, but they were nevertheless offered training in unarmed combat and taught to use firearms, which was revolutionary, really. Many of the agents who were recruited to the SOE had been soldiers who had been exiled or escaped from their own countries, so particularly Norway and the Netherlands. But the main requirement to work at the SOE was that you had to have an in-depth knowledge of the country you were going to be sent to and the ability to speak that language as a native. So for that reason, many SOE agents had dual nationality, or in Section F, they'd maybe been brought up in France, even though they were British, for example. So one of the most important elements of a job of the SOE agent was that you had to maintain a cover story whilst you were carrying out your mission. So on the screen now, what you can see is a document that comes from the National Archives, and it's been taken from the SOE training manual. It explains how important it was for agents to get into character for this disguise. One of the SOE trainers was an actor, and his job was to train the recruits in the final stages of training into making small changes that could radically change the way that you were perceived, such as working to change your walk or your mannerisms. I would like you to just to stop the video in a moment and have a read through of this document, and then discuss with somebody at home just how easy or difficult you think it would be to maintain your SOE cover story, and what would you choose to go with as a cover story. It might be a nice idea to practice changing some mannerisms or try and change your walk and see if anybody notices. Okay, so SOE recruits were trained in a number of skills which you can see on the screen now. This was done in 4 stages, and if at any stage of the process you failed, then you were sent to a place known as the cooler, where they would spend time trying to get you to forget anything you'd learnt about the SOE so far, because it was so top secret they couldn't afford to let failed recruits let the secret out. The thing that they couldn't train you to be able to do in the short time that they had was actually teach you the language skills. So these were vitally important to have in place before you were accepted on the training programme. The majority of the preliminary training took place in Scotland, but recruits learnt to parachute jump in a place near Manchester called Ringway, and the final stages of training took place in Beaulieu in Hampshire. This video clip, which I'm about to play, is from a BBC Two series from a couple of years ago, where modern day people took part in SOE training for a reality TV show, and it just gives you a brief idea of what the training might have been like and what kinds of people might have been recruited.
Are we going to be like sleeping in barracks?
I think it's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be in the middle of nowhere. I think it's going to be quite isolated.
These 14 people are being taken to a country house in Scotland. SOE requisitioned at least 30 such properties during the war. Their secluded locations making them perfect for top secret activities.
Okay, ladies, gents, if you can, please, let's get ourselves off the bus.
Meeting them is one of the school's instructors, Nikki Moffat. She has 27 years of military experience, and when she left, was the highest-ranking woman in the British Army.
The Special Operations Executive was very much about bringing in people who may, on the face of it, have appeared ordinary, and unlocking that extraordinary talent.
Agents were selected from every walk of life, from wealthy aristocrats to refugees fleeing Nazi oppression. SOE would consider anyone with brains and courage, and these modern candidates have been chosen to reflect the diverse range of people recruited and the skill sets they possessed.
Parlez français.
Oui, je parle français.
Und auch, können Sie Deutsch sprechen?
Ja, ich kann Deutsch sprechen.
Pani Maja Polski?
Ja, pani Maja po-ruski.
Languages and a knowledge of Europe were an advantage.
I've done deals in France, the UK, the Scandinavian countries, obviously Germany, Spain, Italy.
As were the physical attributes to fight for their lives if required.
I enjoy Chinese martial arts, Kung Fu would be my preference.
And an ability to work in hostile environments.
In the police, I was put in different situations every single day. A lot of people might have shied away from, but I kind of faced up to them.
One thing that you did have to be as an SOE agent is incredibly brave. The life expectancy of a wireless operator in the field was just 6 weeks, and in fact, before you actually were sent into the field, you had to make a will. SOE agents didn't work alone. They worked in small groups of people which were known as circuits, and each circuit had a code name. They also worked with some useful equipment. So on the next screen here, you can see some of the useful gadgets that they took with them. On the left hand side you have a folding motorcycle, for example, and on the right there is a picture of a suitcase wireless which was similar to the ones used by the female agents that we're going to talk about in the second part of this lecture. The gadgets could get a bit more unusual though. So on the left you can see another document which is taken from the National Archives, which shows you how to make a rat explosive, and on the right is another example of a document from the SOE training manual, which is an example of a sleeve gun, which is quite literally a gun that you hide up your sleeve. And if all of this seems very much like it's come from a James Bond film, that's not really surprising, because the author of the James Bond novels, Ian Fleming, was rumoured to have been an SOE agent, and he certainly worked with many people who were involved with the SOE. He apparently based the character of M on the SOE commander, and the character of Miss Moneypenny was based on one of the senior training officers in Section F, whose name was Vera Atkins, who I will be mentioning again later. In fact, as I've previously mentioned, the SOE was groundbreaking in its use of female agents. So just before we carry on, I'd like you to stop the video and discuss why female agents might have been preferred at this time when women perhaps didn't have such equality as men. Okay, so hopefully we've had a chance to think about that. Women were considered much more inconspicuous than men. So they could move around in occupied France, particularly, much more unnoticed. So they were often used as couriers and wireless operators because they could move about without being checked. They were rarely stopped and searched at checkpoints. So, for example, if they were carrying a suitcase, wireless, nobody wouldn't ask to look in it necessarily. But there were other qualities that they had as well. So historian Juliet Pattinson, who's written about women in the SOE in her book Behind Enemy Lines, Gender Passing and the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War, has said that actually several wartime accounts indicate that male agents were less resourceful and inventive than their female colleagues, and women were well known to play up to stereotypes of being fragile or helpless to get them out of sticky situations. So prior to D-Day, 39 female SOE agents had actually been deployed in France, which is quite a large number, particularly given the low life expectancy of an SOE agent. So in the second part of this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about one female agent in particular. And she became famous thanks to her work with the SOE, so much so that shortly after the war, in the 1950s, I think, or possibly the early 60s, her story was made into a film which is called Carve Her Name with Pride, and you can watch that on the internet. It is black and white, I'll warn you, but I'll put a link in the description. So the lady in question is Violette Szabo, that's her married name. She was born in 1921 in Paris to a British father and a French mother. She grew up in London and France and actually went back and forth between the two in her childhood, but by the outbreak of war she was back living in London. And in 1940 she joined the Women's Land Army. She was sent to Hampshire to pick fruit, but she shortly returned to London and she began to work in an armaments factory. On July the 14th, Bastille Day, so France's National Day, her mother actually sent her out to look for a homesick French soldier to bring home for dinner. So if you remember, her mother was French. So Violette found one. His name was Etienne Szabo, and he was a French and Hungarian soldier in the French Foreign Legion. So they went home for dinner. They fell in love. After 42 days, so less than 2 months, Violette and Etienne got married. She was 19, he was 31, and they had a week's honeymoon, and then Etienne went off to fight in Africa. So on the African continent, he started in Senegal, he went to South Africa, and then he went to a few other places. Violette joined the ATS, and she was stationed in Cheshire at an anti-aircraft battery unit. In 1942, so 2 years after getting married, during one of the leave periods of her husband, she became pregnant, and then when she found that out, she returned to London to give birth, her husband having gone back to war. In June, her daughter Tanya Szabo was born, and in October, Violette discovered quite sadly that her husband had been killed in action, having never met his daughter. So we think that this is what has spurred Violette on to join the SOE. Now, there are very few records of recruitment for the SOE, either because they were destroyed to keep it secret or because they weren't made in the first place. So this is conjecture, and a lot of history is conjecture if there aren't documents. But we think that probably Violette wanted to join the SOE because to get revenge against her husband's death, but she was probably recruited because of her language skills. Remember, she spoke both French and English fluently, and because she'd previously done different war work, so she'd come to the knowledge she'd become known to the authorities. Now, Violette completed all her training, but on the final stage of her training, when she went to Ringway to do her parachute training, she badly damaged her ankle, so she was sent home to recover. She then came back and redid the parachute course, which she passed the second time. It was while she was completing this parachute training for the second time that Violette met the men who would later become part of her circuit, and her circuit was known as salesmen. Violette's first mission took place in April 1944. She was parachuted into the north of France near Cherbourg, where she was due to gather intelligence. So her circuit salesmen had their cover had been blown, and Violette was the only one, because she was new, that the authorities weren't aware of. So she was able to establish that the cover had been blown beyond repair, but also she was able to produce reports on the local factories, which then were used to establish Allied bombing targets. So she went to Paris to report this to her commanding officer. She spent some time in Paris shopping, and then she later was returned to England by RAF plane at the end of April, having spent 1 month in France. Now, her plane was shot down, was struck by enemy fire, and Szabo mistakenly thought that the plane had been shot down, but happily, when she landed with a bit of a thud, and the pilot came to get her, she recognised it was her British pilot, and she delightedly rewarded him with a kiss. So her first mission was very successful. However, the thing that interests me is Szabo's second mission. So Szabo's second mission took place in a part of France which I'm very familiar with, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this story, because it's somewhere that I travel to a lot. Now, on the 8th of June 1944, which was actually Szabo's daughter's second birthday, and it was 2 days after D-Day, Violette Szabo was parachuted by the United States Air Force into a small field outside the village of Soussac in the Limousin region of France. So you can see part of this region of France on the screen on your map there. Now, this area of France had a number of resistance groups known as the Maquis, and they were fighting against the German forces. So it's disparate groups of men hiding in the forests, because it's quite heavily wooded, fighting against the German forces, who were based out of Limoges, which you can see in the top left of the picture. So Soussac's to the southeast of Limoges. Now, these pictures here are pictures of Soussac, which I personally took when I went there a couple of years ago. Now, Violette Szabo's cover story when she was in Soussac was that she was a widow, which obviously she was in real life as well, visiting from Nantes, which is in the further north in France, and her name was Madame Villeray. And in the right hand picture, what you can see is a shop, and above that shop is the accommodation where Violette Szabo stayed while she was staying in Soussac. Now, because this is a part of France that I'm very familiar with, and I have friends in this part of France, I actually was lucky enough when I was 18 to meet an elderly lady who's sadly no longer with us, but who lived in this part of France when Violette Szabo arrived in Soussac, and she told me that Szabo actually really stood out when she arrived in this part of France, because she was wearing the latest Parisian clothing, and this part of France is a very rural, quite poor area where women at that time would not have been wearing the latest Parisian styles, particularly during a war where things were being rationed. So Szabo actually perhaps didn't do such a good job of maintaining her cover story, or of not standing out. Although, remember, historical sources, even though this was a person who was there at the time, they need corroboration. And this story has only been told to me by one person. It hasn't been corroborated. So we do need to take it with a pinch of salt. Anyway, Szabo's job when she was in the Limousin was to make contact with the local Maquis, so the local groups of people who were fighting the Germans, and she was supposed to be helping them with some sabotage missions, but her commanding officer in the salesman circuit thought that these groups were too disorganised, and they decided that she should go further south and make contact with some other groups who were a bit more organised. So at 9:30 a.m. on the 10th of June, she set off on her mission. Now, she went with a young guy whose name was Jacques Dufour, who was one of the Maquis leaders from the region, and they also picked up another French resistance fighter who's a friend of Jacques Dufour called Jean Barriot. Now, they were supposed to go by bicycle, but Jacques Dufour decided that he just wasn't going to make the journey by bike. It was too far, and that he wanted to use the car. But unfortunately, the Germans had forbidden the use of cars. So since D-Day, they'd said no one who was French is allowed to drive around in a car. And also in this region of France, a German officer had been kidnapped by the resistance. So there were roadblocks up looking for the German officer. So these two things meant that when the three of them in their car arrived outside a place called Salon-le-Tour, they hit a German roadblock, and obviously that was bad news. So Jean Barriot managed to get out of the car before they actually got pulled over by the roadblock, and he managed to go back to the rest of the salesman's circuit team and warn them that their two friends had been caught by the Germans. Now, when the Germans actually did stop the car, both Szabo and Dufour leapt out. He leapt to the left and she leapt to the right, and she went under cover of a tree whilst Dufour opened fire. Then there was a gun battle, which unfortunately a woman in a barn opposite was killed. But more Germans arrived in armoured cars, and Szabo and Dufour managed to run across the road, leap over a gate, run across a field towards a stream, and run up a hill towards some trees. But unfortunately, Szabo fell over. Now, remember, she had a weak ankle, so Dufour stopped to try and help her, but she knew that would ultimately be dangerous for him. So she told him to carry on without her. She managed to drag herself behind a tree. She used her gun to provide some covering fire, which allowed Dufour to make his escape and hide in a barn. And Szabo fought the Germans until basically she ran out of ammunition, and then she was captured. Now, there's some dispute over how much resistance she put up, and this is another thing that I just want you to think about with your historian head on. So in R.J. Minnie's biography of Violette Szabo, she describes her as putting up fierce resistance with her Sten gun. But the German documents say there were no German injuries or casualties. And in the biography of Vera Atkins, remember her, who was the intelligence officer for the French section of SOE, she said that there was a lot of confusion about what happened to Szabo, that the story itself had changed 4 times, and that Szabo's Sten gun incident was probably a fabrication. Szabo's most recent biographer, Susan Ottaway, talks about this famous gun battle in her book. So does Tanya Szabo in her book, and a number of other historians. But there are some historians who say that they are in doubt about this happening. So I just want you to consider why that might be. Why are there, with your historian hat on, why might there be different stories about what happened? You can pause the video whilst you discuss it. Okay, so the thing is, nobody was there to give a first-hand account of what happened, and the people that are giving accounts perhaps have ulterior reasons. Obviously, Tanya Szabo wants her mother to come out a hero, so is going to suggest that she put up more of a fight, perhaps, than she really did. Likewise, the Germans are not going to want to look like they've been, injured by a single woman, so they're going to perhaps suggest that there was less of a fight. This is why, as historians, we always need to try and use corroborating sources, and here we don't have any. On the screen, what you can see is a memorial to Violette Szabo, which is near Susac. It's actually next to the field where she landed. And again, these are photos that I took myself the last time that I visited. So what happened to Szabo next? She was transferred to the custody of the Germans, the SS, in Limoges. She was interrogated for 4 days. She gave a fake name. She called herself Vicky Taylor. The word Taylor being the word Szabo in Hungarian, so we think it's a play on words, which shows she's got a bit of a sense of humour. She then was moved to a prison in Paris. She got taken to Gestapo headquarters, where she was interrogated and tortured, and they had by now discovered that she was an SOE agent. Now, as time is ticking on, obviously the Allies are advancing in France, so the Germans decide that they need to send the most valuable French prisoners to Germany. So Szabo and some other SOE agents are transferred to Germany. Now, Szabo herself is taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and the journey itself took 18 days, where they were basically half-starved on the train. While she was there, she endured hard labour, malnutrition. She was sent to work at a factory at another camp, but they refused, along with some other people that were there. She protested, and she then got sent back to Ravensbrück, where she was made to work in a fabric store. Because she had protested, she was punished quite severely, sent to do some hard physical labour, and made to work outside in the bitter winter in only her summer clothes, received barely any food, had no blankets, but all the time she continued to maintain her morale, be optimistic about being freed, and plan her escape. She was in Ravensbrück concentration camp from August 1944 until February the 5th, 1945, where she was executed by one of the SS officers at the age of only 23. Post-war, she was awarded posthumously for her bravery. Her George Cross was collected by her daughter, who was now orphaned. So her daughter was 4 years old in 1946 when she collected the George Cross awarded to her mother. And the following is an extract from a newspaper report at the time. Madame Szabo volunteered to undertake a particularly dangerous mission in France. She was parachuted into France in April 1944 and undertook the task with enthusiasm. In her execution of the delicate researches entailed, she showed great presence of mind and astuteness. She was twice arrested by the German security authorities, but each time managed to get away. Eventually, however, with other members of her group, she was surrounded by the Gestapo in a house in the southwest of France. Resistance appeared hopeless, but Madame Szabo, seizing a Sten gun and as much ammunition as she could carry, barricaded herself in part of the house and, exchanging shot for shot with the enemy, killed or wounded several of them. By constant movement, she avoided being cornered and fought until she dropped exhausted. She was arrested and had to undergo solitary confinement. She was then continuously and atrociously tortured, but never by word or deed gave away any of her acquaintances or told the enemy anything of any value. She was ultimately executed. Madame Szabo gave a magnificent example of courage and steadfastness. So again, with your historian hat on, you might want to think about some of that information, whether it can be corroborated, but ultimately I think we can agree that Violette Szabo was a magnificent example of courage and steadfastness. So I was inspired to find out about the SOE after I read a book when I was 18 by Sebastian Faulks, which is called Charlotte Gray. But there have been lots of fictional representations of this organisation, and the most recent one that I've seen is a film called A Call to Spy, which is based on the true stories of some of the female agents of the SOE. So I'm going to show you the trailer in a moment. Before I do that, I also just want to flag up there is a young adult novel, My Story, codename Celine, by Jim Eldridge, which also tells the story of a female agent working in the SOE. So if you're interested in this, then these fictional accounts might have something that you'd be interested in following up. So here's the trailer for A Call to Spy, which is a 13.
We're desperate for information about France. Churchill has asked us to create a secret army of spies.
This is a rudimentary operation. Women will be more inconspicuous. Make sure they're pretty.
For you or for the Germans? I don't believe we've met.
Virginia Hall.
We could set her up as a journalist.
Good Lord, Vera. She has a wooden leg.
Would you suspect this girl's a spy? Rumor has it you are the best wireless operator in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force.
Signaling is like music. There is a rhythm to it.
I'm a pacifist, and they are teaching us to kill. They're training us to survive.
We need you as our first female field agent.
Don't be fooled. common folks are becoming collaborators.
Acquire information, build resistance,
Crash.
and set France ablaze.
If you have any doubts, tell me now.
This feels dangerous.
We're here now. We've seen it through.
We've had no choice but to learn the hard way how to do this. Trial and a lot of error.
Let's go.
Go now!
The Germans are locating our signals faster than anticipated.
We must keep trying.
Who is she? I'm going to ask one more time.
The Germans will stop at nothing till they find you.
I'm not giving up. We're not giving up.
Up!
Maybe we're here only for a short time. But what we do while we're here? Changes the course of the future.
So in that film, you will hear about some familiar names that I've talked about in this lecture. So Vera Atkins, but also on this last slide, if you are interested in the SOE and the stories of these women and men who were bravely putting their lives at risk to try and bring us a quicker end to the war, then you might find you want to do some further research about some of these agents. So Noor Inayat Khan is referenced in that film. Virginia Hall as well is the American lady in the film. That you also might want to look up Odette Sansom, who's also known as Odette Hallows, Christina Scarbeck, Bill Hudson, who was the model for James Bond, and Henri Dericourt, who controversially may well have been a double agent for the SOE, but also for the Germans. So it's just some names if you are interested in this to look up. And that's it for this lecture. So I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've remembered some of the details for your follow-up activity. It's something that I'm really personally very interested in. So if you do go away and do some further research into any of these characters, then please do tell me about it. And thank you for your attention.